Composite Gloves here, and today we are going to be talking about your brain and music. So I've gotten a lot of this information from various articles I've read, just scouring the internet, and two really awesome books. One is Musicophilia by a guy named Oliver Sacks. And he studies sort of like weird stuff that happened to people when they got disorders, like people who have musical hallucinations that are not the kind that you would think. And then the other one that I have been reading up on is called Your Brain on Music by I forgot his name, but I believe it's Levitian is his last name. Levitian, something with an L and an E and a V, and then some sort of a, suffix. And the middle initial, I believe, is R. I can't remember his first name. Robert? I don't know. It's some name. Okay. That's an amazing book though. Like the content is, I got a whole separate book, and just started writing down everything I was learning from that. So one of the things, I'm going to just tell you weird stuff. This doesn't necessarily help you critical listening wise, but I feel like it should be included here because everyone seems to approach up to there. They go through the structure of the ear, parts of the ear, and then they just say black magic once it gets to the brain. It's not black magic. It's just really complicated. And it kind of is a little bit black magic because there are things we still have a lot of questions about, but there are a lot of things that we have learned. And one of the biggest things I got out of these studies was the fact that your brain does everything in parallel and how it just integrates everything into all different parts of your brain. Like you might say one person might lose their ability to tell what pitches are, but they can still sense melody, or this guy can sense rhythm, but only under these circumstances. There are people in the world who can only remember who they are or anything about their life when they are playing music. There's people with Parkinson's who can't pick up a bowl of cereal. They can't feed themselves because their hands shake so much, but they can play the piano. Just like things that are like weird. And so these guys, and of course, so there's a whole bunch of people out there doing this, and I'm not an expert, so I'm going to use really down-to-earth terms, really inaccurate descriptions because of my gross uneducatedness in this area. If that sentence wasn't gross enough. So, but it's been really interesting. Like, why do people like certain music like this? And why don't they like this music? And why did this cause that? And all these things. So first off, your brain, the eighth cranial membrane, it goes to two places. In fact, it might go to more. I don't even know. But it's got a direct line to, I believe it's the cerebellum. And it's got another line, and that goes to the brain stem through up to the audio cortex. I guess I'm not like totally solid on the structure of things. I've been reading mostly about the effects of what happens. But anyways, it goes through where first, I forgot what part, it's the amygdala. I've been reading a lot of words I don't know. I used to know how to pronounce these words. Anyways, that's where you basically check for danger. But one of the things about your brain is it's a parallel processing unit. This thing just does everything at the same time. It doesn't do anything in serial. It does it all at the same time. As a result, processes and certain parts of your brain will finish before other processes do, and they will update each other and it'll go even faster. And that's like, I guess you could call that changing your mind. But we got to back up a little bit. So neural firings is sort of where this sort of comes from, is if we can observe what parts of your brain activate and send messages. This is like, they get a lot more in detail about it. I'm just going to leave it at that. Then you can theoretically understand how the brain is processing a thing. And so you hear sound, it goes to your ear, you check for danger, but at the same time, a whole load of other things happens. So one of the cool things though, that is kind of related to critical listening and is really wild, is that your brain functions on absolute pitch. So if I were to play a sound for you, and we were to do an EEG scan of your brain, we would be able to see by which, let's back up. There's a part, when I say your brain functions on absolute pitch, there is a part of your brain, like a spot, that is assigned to each pitch. So if we were to play like 100 hertz tone, you would have a spot on your brain that would light up for 100 hertz. That like blew my mind already. I was like, what? That's weird. And then what got me was they don't do that for other senses. Like that just doesn't happen. When you like think about it, not think about it, but if I were to present to you the color orange and then you were to be like, whoa, color orange, the best color ever. Yeah, I know. But you would not have a part of your brain that would light up for orange. At least at the time that this text was written, that was not a thing. So, but And he said that for any other sense. So so that's interesting is that you have a spot in your brain. So if I were to do an EEG scan, play for you something, I could tell the frequencies you were listening to by looking at your brain. But I could not tell you how you interpret rhythm. I could not tell you. Now there's a load of other studies that have delved in to try and understand how this was. So this is really interesting. And this comes with another of things, because a number of other implications, because people think that they don't have perfect pitch, but it can certainly be learned. And they like did some studies that were really interesting where they gave people tuning forks, said, go home and listen to this tuning fork 3 times a day. And they did. And they came back and this had previously been done with musicians. So when they came back, they were told to do this. Okay, they were told to do this every day for a week. I'm just so excited about this. And then they were told not to do it for a week. And then they came back, and because they were not musicians, they didn't have a letter for their tone. Their tone was given a name. It was from I Love Lucy. Those names. What were the names? I forgot the names. Anyway, let's just go with Fred. So your tone's name is Fred. And they would play back tones in the laboratory, and they were expected to be able to say which tone was Fred. And they could do it. So that was really interesting right off the bat. Then they did another one where they got just random people. Of course, they had a whole sequence of how they did this. And they brought them in, and they asked them to sing popular songs. And they noticed that they would sing them with similar timbres. They noticed that they would sing them with the correct tempo, actually. And now you got to remember that songs, they break it apart so gradually in the book that it's difficult to like tell you everything you need to know to understand the impact of some of this. But they could tell the timbre, they could tell the songs they sang them at the correct tempos. And most of the time, they even started on the correct pitch, like the correct key that the song was actually written in. So this is a really interesting thing, because these were just like common people. A lot of them didn't even want to do it. Like they felt duped because the ad was like memory experiment or something. So it's kind of an interesting deal. It further gets interesting when you consider he starts breaking down how many different things music can have in it. So we have that thing called timbre that we've talked about. And he treats timbre the same way I do, but he also points out that it is not really a defined thing. So we treat it, and he pretty much treats it as the overtone structure and the relative volumes of each of the harmonics or overtones in that structure relative to a fundamental. And so, and in some cases, there is no fundamental. So it's treated very much the same in your brain on music. And so think about this. You can have a song. They've done studies. You could tell a song apart even if you change the dynamics. And you might not think that's a big deal, like it just got louder. But you got to think about it. That's different signal reaching your ear. So some people have disorders where they just heard a new song. Like they're having mega big problems. Their brain has issues. Now, the other thing was you can transpose that. You can change the key. You can change the speed. You can distort it. You can change instruments. You can change the singer. I guess that's the same thing. You can change speed radically. You can reverse it, and people will still tell you what song that is if they know that song. And they've even done experiments where they've reversed it, done all these things to popular songs, and within 2 notes, people knew what song it was. So that's wild that your brain is capable of analyzing something so much that it can just pull stuff out. There are other things that are really interesting too. So I'm just listing off crazy stuff because it's really crazy and kind of cool to think about. Let's talk about tone deaf and rhythm deaf. So I actually have a copy of it right here. It's called Musicophilia. In it, he talks about a guy, like people who were struck by lightning and just all of a sudden had sudden desires to play piano. And the guy actually got so into it, his wife divorced him. He was a surgeon, and he became a pianist. He started writing music. He got really interested in it all of a sudden. A lot of this stuff at the beginning of the book has to do with the temporal lobe and the different hemispheres of the brain. So tone deafness, I believe that's left hemispherical. And so it's complicated because of that pitch thing I told you about earlier. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where you process melody or contour. Some people are able to sense melody, but they are completely unable to sense contour, the ups and downs of a melody, but they can sing a melody. Like it's weird. Like they can't do that. And there are different parts of the brain responsible for that. But so that means, some people, when you go tone deaf, there's like all these different levels depending on where in your brain you either got injured or if you had a stroke or something. And so some people are tone deaf only when it comes to instruments, but they can understand speech. Like there is no music to these, like there's literally no music to these people. There's like exclusively speech. Like an orchestra would sound like pots and pans being thrown down. People who even composers, some of these people were professional composers, had a stroke, and then they could not enjoy music. It was like torture. It was like random noise. Like their brain couldn't make sense of it. So that's tone deaf. Now tone deaf, of course, is just, you might be able to, now there's other weird disorders, like you're able to enjoy songs, but you cannot sing that song. That's the one most people are familiar with. For the life of you, you just can't sing that tune. And there are parts of your brain that are responsible for that. There's rhythm deafness, which, if you didn't know that's a thing, it's actually a lot easier to go tone deaf than rhythm deaf because rhythm is dispersed all throughout the brain. So, but there are parts that it focuses on. So some people might be able to play rhythm, but they can't sense rhythm, or vice versa. They can sense rhythm, but they cannot play rhythm, or it's both. I mean, it's just weird. And that's even harder to get, again, because it's so spread out. There's other weird stuff like professional musicians. So you might be saying to yourself, I'm a producer, I'm into music. No, we're talking professional musicians here. If you went to college to learn how to play your horn with the intention to be professional, you know what kind of exercises you do. Well, what's interesting is those people, I like to think that I fall into this category at least a bit because I've done all this stuff, but I think everyone wants to think that, so I'm hesitant to do things like that. But anyways, you do all these scale exercises, you're just taught from the ground up. Like, you could do these things, you want to be good at music, practice scales, learn the notes, learn all your fingerings, learn how to play with emotion, learn the impact. Like, you're just taught how to be a musician. And as a result, now this is more noticeable for children who were brought up with music and being trained, and the more intensely it was, the more obvious. But different parts of your brain actually get bigger. I believe your cerebellum gets bigger and different parts of your motor cortex, but I could be wrong. But one of the interesting things they said was, professional, I believe it's a neurologist, can tell a musician's brain easily, but they would be hard pressed to tell a mathematician's brain, an artist's brain. When I say artist, I mean like a painter, any other thing, like a literature, a writer, whatever. It would be hard to find it, but a musician, they're easy to spot. So that's kind of weird. That's just weird. And so there's just all these weird things. What are some other cool things? There's a whole load of them. There are people who had these musical hallucinations where they had a stroke and they were then plagued. They literally never heard silence. Their brain was constantly generating music to play, and they had to live with that for like 4 years. And sometimes lobotomies actually fixed the problem. Other times they were screwed, or other times people would have certain songs that would trigger it. One guy was a music critic, and he had to quit his job. He actually developed a phobia because every time he heard music, he would begin to have a seizure, or he would zone out. It's crazy. So it's kind of weird that kind of a thing would go down. There's weird stuff about mental practice. For example, mental practice, you're playing, and once you get to a point where you can pretty much visualize it, your brain can rerun that neural process over and over and over. It's as good as actual practice. Like, that's pretty wild. That was another thing they talked about. So just a number of weird things. The temporal lobe was generally associated with emotion and musical context, where you process like, oh, this is whether a musical statement is funny or not funny. Obviously, it's way more complicated. The left and right side of the brain thing is sort of true. Interesting thing was, up until I believe it was like 2005, they did brain research mostly on right-handed people, simply because central processing units that your brain has, like your linguist center and stuff, apparently they can be restructured in different areas depending on whether or not you're ambidextrous, right-handed, left-handed, went through, because your brain, it's called neuroplasticity, the ability to move these processes around in the event that, you need to, like maybe part of your brain got damaged and you need to move this, because that's an important thing. One thing that was interesting, early musicians, as you learn music and you're able to describe it with words, you will gain your linguistic center will become enhanced. I believe it even gets a little bit bigger, because you are now, when you hear music, you also are activating because you're able to think about it with your language. And so your linguistic center becomes active. So that's the thing. There was an interesting bit in there about babies from the age of 6 months to a year are more sensitive. Like, apparently this is like, in general, the ideal development stage for rhythm. And so the more rhythms you expose a child to at that age, the more easily those will be the rhythms they are akin to. Because if you go over to Africa, they have different bass rhythms they like, different tonal structures they like, which also, I believe tonal structure is a different time of growth though, on average. Versus over here in the States, you know, it's 4/4, dance rhythm, stuff like that. So that's like what's big. And so that's like kind of cultural music. That's why each culture, it's sort of like how you grow up with a language and you just learn the language that your parents speak. And as long as they speak it around you, you're pretty much solid. So sometimes people are at a disadvantage because they weren't exposed to music. But then there are cases where that was like people who were growing up and like barely even knew what music was. One guy I was reading about didn't even have a sense of what singing was. Someone said sing a song and he didn't even know what that meant because his household was so devoid of music. But then he became like a genius later on and became a professional musician, all these things. There's something I wanted to say about the cerebellum. Cerebellum is responsible for timing, and apparently it was pretty standardized at the time that this particular book was written that it was not associated with emotions. Emotions were another phenomena. And what's interesting is they found discoveries according to their findings, that was wrong. And he starts pulling together all these pieces. And at the end, they conclude basically that because parts of your motor cortex are active and that triggers parts of your cerebellum because your cerebellum's involved with the timing mechanism. So your ability to tap your foot is related to the cerebellum. And they've even gotten some computer programs to simulate the brain that actually can extract meter, might not be able to extract tempo or the correct meter. You might be doing double time or half time, but they've gotten programs to actually simulate this part via the same way the brain works. That's like a whole nother story, those programs. So those were like a chapter, and that was just describing what they could do. That wasn't even like in depth at all. But what's interesting is that means that as a performer of music, if you play an instrument, I'm not sure how it works for composition. It probably has some other interesting implications, but that means that when you play music, you're experiencing emotions that only you will ever experience. No one else will experience the emotions you experience as a musician. It is unique to you. Only performers will understand. It's really interesting. And I know that some of these things just apply across a whole load of skill sets, not just music, but very curious sort of deal right there. So like, for example, runners get into a groove. I'm willing to put my money down. There is some sort of a correlation, an emotional response embedded in their cerebellum that they experience that people who have not run might not experience. There's so many exceptions, so many unusual things. It just kind of blew my mind how you could just pull everything apart. You can see I'm like struggling to find words. I'm still reading about it too. It's so crazy. There was a couple other interesting things. Oh yeah, your ear is so friggin' nuts. Like they used an analogy in there that I really like. They said, if you were to take like a bucket and then put a shirt over it and you were to look up at the bucket, at this bed sheet. Let's say you're in this bucket with this white sheet over it and someone's dropping ping pong balls on it. Your job is to tell me in the bucket, like you're in the bucket. Your job is to tell me where the ping pong fell from, how far, what was its surrounding area, because that's pretty much what your ear is doing. Your ear is to create an acoustic space. And when reflections bounce off, they come back to you and stuff. It's got to be able to tell just from your tympanic membrane moving. Now, of course, we know about bone conduction, and there are obviously a few other cues, but for the most part, your tympanic membrane moving, and even then it's still pretty much vibration, you have to tell the size of the room, how big the room is, the size of the room, like the materials the room is made out of. You'd be surprised how good you are at this. Where the sound source is, up, down, left, right, all these things. You can tell the timbre, you can tell what made the sound. Like, it's insane what you can do. You could probably pick out your mom's voice or a close loved one's voice in a crowd with hundreds of other people. If that loved one said something like loud enough that you heard it, you would be able to tell who it was. Like, that's pretty crazy that you have memory like this. You could tell it even if they were sick, even if they said it loud or soft, like you could pull it apart. Your brain is so phenomenal at this. So anyways, this is it's turning into a little bit long of a video, but it's just incredible what your brain can do. And I want you to be aware of all these things. Hopefully you've been made a little more aware, because when you're listening, you got to keep in mind, your brain is what you hear. Like that's what you hear. Hearing happens in the brain. Doesn't happen anywhere else. Happens in your brain. And so maybe one day I'll disagree with that statement on some like philosophical level or scientifically more correct level. But for the most part, that's where it happens. Really curious thing. You should really appreciate it. Appreciate what you have and what's going for you. There are people with weird problems, people who hear music endlessly, and to them, it's not even musical. They can't process melody or contour. Some people, you know, you say you don't have perfect pitch. A lot of people do. And when in reality they do, or they can't hold a tune in a bucket where they have no idea how hard it is for someone else. They might go to a concert and it could be sheer torture because it just sounds like meaningless metallic like noises coming at them all the time. Just really a unique thing you have going for you. So hope this was useful for you. I hope you learned some things. Check out those books. Very cool. Subscribe to this channel if you're interested in more. We're going to be delving more into listening. Continue to practice your listening, because as you practice listening, this is my theory. When you practice listening, remember how there's different parts of your brain for each frequency? I'm willing to bet you can consciously, as you listen and create impulse responses, as you generate, oh, this is what happens when X is in my environment. This is what happens when this is in my environment. That's also one of the ways you build up where stuff is. You just grow up and you start building up this vocabulary, and so you could pull on stuff. The same thing can happen for you when you do critical listening. So as you just build up this vocabulary, and it can only be done via practice, deliberate, intentional practice, you will be able to pull things apart in ways that no one else can literally do. Like they just won't know what you're talking about until they do the practice. Then you'll be able to you'll just be able to do such interesting things. Like you'll just rip sound apart in front of you. And I think that part of it's from the recognition that your brain knows, oh, this part of my brain went off, and you're forming a new neural path to send to, you know, new connections in your brain. And that's what's so powerful about this. That's why daily practice is so good. So I know I didn't pull out names of the brain simply because I feel like I probably can't say a number of them correctly, first of all. And I don't want to mix match things that I don't have completely solid in my head. I was pulling out a lot of concepts, but I actually started writing down all sorts of stuff. And then I go through my notes occasionally, because it's really good after you read for like a half hour. You come back in like an hour and just look through your notes, and you just remember so much more. So I just didn't want to mix up parts of the brain with what they do. So I tried to sort of stay away from that. But those are just some interesting ideas. There's still a load of the book. I'm only on like page 100 in this one. The other one, I'm on like page 200, somewhere around there. So yes, there might be more videos to talk about weird things that I've discovered through this book. But for the most part, yeah, just your brain's incredible. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and have a blessed day.